Well, there's been concern for several years now about the impact that student loans are having on people's lives once they're done with their time in college. New research looks at what can be done to provide a quote unquote nudge and help people on that repayment path so that they have limited negative impacts. Pleasure to be joined by Katie Milkman, Professor of Operations, Information, and Decisions here at the Wharton School, and obviously one of the important people involving this research. Katie, always great to talk with you and talk about your research. Thanks for a couple of moments.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, so tell us about this research. And I think the interesting thing at the top, 13 million people involved in this research?
Yeah, well, I should say, it was led by an amazing PhD student named Rob Kwan, and it was made possible by a partnership with the Department of Education, and an incredible group working there in fall of 2023. And they were planning a communication campaign after the pause that you might remember happened during COVID on requirements that students repay their loans, the pause on interest. And so we were thinking about how could we be helpful. They already had a plan to start communicating with people who missed their first payment once that payment pause ended, and they wanted to pull in behavioral scientists to help. So we got this amazing opportunity to do science at this incredible scale with 13 million borrowers who missed a payment and needed a little nudge to get them back on track. And we had the opportunity to be part of thinking, what might be most effective, and testing to make sure that then the Department of Education could use the very best insights from our work to move forward and try to help borrowers who were at risk of delinquency.
So when you say nudge, you mean what?
So we helped develop an email campaign. So if a borrower had a missed payment, they'd get a notification from the Department of Education that was an alert essentially to say, this has happened and here's some advice on next steps. And we varied what those messages said. And so by nudge, I mean there's no change in the incentive structure they face. They're not getting different interest rates or different rules applied to them or different periods of forbearance. Instead, it's just a different way of communicating the same information to see what's most effective, using insights from behavioral science to try to make it maximally helpful to borrowers. Yes. Yeah, the idea of behaviorally informed is just that a group of scientists who were trying to take the best insights they could from the behavioral science literature about how humans make decisions, developed a set of messages that simplified things as much as possible, made it as clear as possible what the action steps should be. And then we tested, first of all, was that better than just sort of sending people a notification that they should go check in with their servicer? Could we do better than that by using sort of every trick up our sleeves as behavioral scientists? That's the first thing we tested in this project. And then we also did some other testing of things we weren't sure about, where we weren't positive which way it would go. For instance, we said, does it really help if we bug them again? Should we send a reminder, not just one message, but two? And does that create value? We also looked at whether or not when we talked to them about actions they could take that would reduce that would be helpful, actions like signing up for what's called an income driven repayment plan, where if you have lower income you can actually make smaller payments. So this is really helpful for a lot of people struggling to make payments to switch and sign up for that kind of a plan. If we described that and talked about the savings they could achieve potentially in percentage terms, would that be more effective, or would it be more effective to talk about the savings they might receive in terms of what they'd owe each month in dollar terms? We weren't sure. So we tested that. And we also tested whether or not it's better when we had multiple pieces of advice for people. Should we give them one piece of advice at a time? So each email focused on one piece of advice, or should we give them two pieces of advice repeatedly? So assume you only can send, say, 2 communications to someone a month because there's some limit on either, nagging or how many times you can bother them before they click unsubscribe. So you have that limit. Are you better off separating your points or putting them all together? So those were the things we tested. Do the behaviorally informed emails work? Do reminders make them better? Should we talk about savings in percentage or dollar terms? And should we give you one action step at a time or 2 action steps at once repeatedly?
So 2 questions for me off of the scenario you just laid out. One being, it sounds like giving them the information, that the element of having an option or having a variety of kind of components that that they can refer to certainly help the people have a better understanding of ways that they can kind of deal with some of these issues.
Absolutely. So we think there's value add, and we empirically demonstrate that the sort of package of not just telling you you need to check in and figure out what's going on, but giving you this guidance about it might be a good idea to sign up for auto debit pay or automatic payments so that you don't have to think every month to go and make your payment. It might be a good idea to sign up for these income driven repayment plans. We do believe that that information is going to be valuable and that we can frame it in a valuable way, and we find that we can. So that, I think, is the least interesting part of the paper in some respect, although it's always nice to prove an assumption holds. So we find that that is beneficial and reduces 60-day delinquencies after borrowers receive those kinds of communications. But I think what's more important and more interesting is also some of the things we learned on top of that that were maybe not quite as intuitive. In fact, more important than that was actually just sending a reminder. The reminder was more impactful than the behaviorally informed initial email itself. So nagging really works. That's a theme of a lot of research I've done. We just want to remind you multiple times if you haven't taken action on something important, and that really boosts the efficacy even of these behaviorally informed, sort of well-designed reminders. We also learned that when we talk about what you could save in percentage terms, that was more effective than talking to you about the dollar amount you could save, which I think is really interesting and potentially generalizable to a lot of contexts. And then the final big takeaway was that we were better off giving you the same two pieces of advice twice across two emails than sending one message with one piece of advice followed by a second message with just one piece of advice. So rather than breaking up two things you want to tell people so that they only have to think about one step at a time, you're better off hammering that home twice. And that was, I think, a real question. Like, simplification is important, but so is repetition. And we were able to isolate, at least in this case, that repetition beats simplification.
So let me go back to the component of the savings in percentage terms, and why you think potentially that was more beneficial to people than actually seeing what the cold hard dollar number was in terms of what they would be saving.
It's a really great question, and we truly didn't know what the answer would be. Past research, there's reasons to think it could go either way. Dollars might be simpler and easier to interpret if people aren't super comfortable thinking in percentage terms. Um, what we Our best explanation, and it's still a guess, and future research is needed to really look under the hood, because all we have at this point is just we sent emails, this one worked better. So we don't have, we don't have interviews with people, we don't have the kind of data I'd love to have to explain the why. But our
Right.
best guess is that the percentage numbers were quite large. So we're talking about something like thinking about a 46% reduction or a 40% reduction in your payment. And dollar terms were maybe, similar in scale. So like that's about a $40 reduction in your monthly payment is also roughly 40%. So these are the kinds of numbers we're throwing around at people. They're pretty big percentages, and maybe the dollar isn't as huge. We know from some recent research by other scholars that when you look at a percentage, you think of it on a scale from 0 to 100. Of course, that's not true, right? I could give you 300% increase in your
Right.
bill, or
Right.
right, but we think of them as it being on that scale. So when numbers get sort of in the 2-digit range and get up close anywhere near 100%, people think that's a huge savings because 100 is the max. And these numbers were pretty big on the percentage scale. So one possibility is that in percentage terms, this felt bigger in magnitude because of that sense that anything that's getting close to 100 is wow, massive, which
Yeah.
is not fully accurate, but it's a perception people have. So that might be why percentages beat dollars, but we don't know for sure. And one of the fun things about an experiment like this is we can point to what works, and we can also point to exciting new directions that researchers who like to dig into the why, and you could put somebody in an MRI scanner and try to explore how do they react differently when they see numbers versus percentages, or dollars versus percentages. Both are numbers, of course. But does the brain process that differently? Or if you ask people to talk about what they imagine being able to spend on now after showing them a number in percentage terms that they might be able to save, or in dollar terms, would they think of different things? So there's a whole host of research you could do to follow up on this, and we think that's really exciting, but it's not the focus of this project. Here we just show it works better we speculate a little bit about why, and we are excited to see what future researchers find.
Can you estimate then off of this research and I guess off of this group, potentially how many delinquencies could have been prevented if this path had been followed?
Yeah, well, what's really exciting about even small gains at scale is how massive they can be. So, if once you sort of imagine, what if we scaled the best performer to all 13 million borrowers who had been in this experiment, which is, of course, straightforward for an organization like the Department of Education to do. They could use now the best performer. What we see is just over this time period studied, it would have averted about 80,000 60-day delinquencies, just these small changes to improving messages. And I think what's exciting about that is it shows the power of behavioral science and testing at scale to make an impact on lives. These
Yeah.
are essentially free adjustments to a messaging campaign that have the potential for large impact. And again, each individual effect is pretty small, but when you scale it to 13 million people, that's when you start to see there could be real benefits. And in fact, we know this campaign did prevent delinquencies because people got these behaviorally informed messages, and it had this impact.
So you mentioned about, hopefully doing more research in this area, but that being said, off of the research that you've done here, what do you think is your biggest takeaway that people should really kind of understand about this process?
I mean, this is one of those projects where it's hard to boil it down to one takeaway because there's so much, but probably the one takeaway is reminders really work. Reminders really work. And I guess the second takeaway would be, when you use behavioral science and you do A/B testing, you can squeeze more juice out of your, the lemon or the orange or whatever metaphor you want to use. We were able to make those reminders not only work by using behavioral science, but we were able to use A/B testing to optimize further in ways that are pretty potent. And so I'm a big fan of A/B testing. I'm a big fan of applying scientific insights to improve communications. And this just shows that both of those things matter and can have huge positive impact on our wallets.
Great, Katie, great work. Thanks very much for joining us and giving us all this insight.
Thank you so much for having me.
You got it. Katie Milkman, Professor of Operations, Information, and Decisions here at the Wharton School.